Okay, we want to take this time now to go to questions and answers. Let me just remind you that if you have a question for Dr. Craig, you want to line up at this microphone here. If you have a question for Dr. Tooley, at this microphone here. We will alternate questions for the debaters, beginning with Dr. Craig. Each debater will be given 2 minutes to respond to the question. The other debater will have 1 minute for counter response.
Maybe we might need it.
And I understand we're going to take about a half an hour, Mr. Helms, about a half an hour for Q&A, which means it's possible that you could be standing in line for the entire half hour and not get your question asked. So just be prepared for that eventuality. That's bound to happen, I suppose. Yes. 2 minutes for the response, 1 minute for the counter response. Are you going to do the timing on that too? Okay. Are you ready, Dr. Craig?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Dr. Tooley?
Yes.
Okay. We'll begin over here. Please, sir. Your question for Dr. Craig.
Hi. My name is Javen. My question is, well, your first point was the cosmological argument, which that there must be a first cause and that God is the first cause. Doesn't this just extend the problem, because then you must ask where God came from and what was the cause of said God?
Okay, good question.
Okay, go ahead.
Notice the first premise. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Something cannot come into being out of nothing. It can't come into being without a cause. But something which is eternal, which exists without beginning, wouldn't need to have a cause. And this isn't special pleading for God, because this is what the atheist has always said about the universe. The universe is eternal and uncaused, and therefore there doesn't need to be an explanation. But my argument is that for both philosophical and scientific reasons, we now have good grounds for thinking that the universe did begin to exist, and that points to its ground in a timeless cause which never began to exist.
Dr. Tooley, a minute response.
Right. What's happening here is that Bill appeals to a very restricted version of the causal principle. It's one that deals with things coming into existence. But consider something an electron at a given moment, right? The electron doesn't come into existence at that moment, but its existence at that time has a cause in terms of earlier existence of states of that electron. So a correct principle will say that whenever you have a temporally located state of affairs, it's reasonable to believe that there is a necessary causal condition of that sort of thing, right? Now, I would maintain that anything that's causally related to anything else has temporal location. And so if God causes the universe, then God, so to speak, is in time, right? And so then an unrestricted causal principle will apply to states of God as well, right? And so the sort of cosmological argument that Bill appeals to, right, it all depends upon restricting the causal principle in a way that's completely unjustified. And once you shift from that to an unrestricted version, then the problem that was raised by the speaker comes up, and there's no satisfactory answer to it.
Question for Dr. Tooley?
Yes. Dr. Tooley, how do you personally account for objective value, morality, and purpose in a universe without God?
Well, the idea is this, that on any view, ultimately, you have to have right-making and wrong-making properties, right? And so, for example, you might maintain that causing unnecessary suffering is morally wrong, right? And so what's the natural account of that? Well, the natural account of that is that there is a notion of being a wrong-making property, and it's a property of the property of causing unnecessary suffering, right? And so that's the natural reading of it, right? Now what happens is that Bill rejects that natural reading, describes it as abstract and so on, says he doesn't understand it, right? You know, philosophers working in that area have no difficulty understanding the notion, right? And he substitutes something else for it. And what he substitutes is actually very unclear, right? It talks about, that the existence of an omniscient being who's loving and so forth and so on, somehow is a truth-making state of affairs for, things being good or bad, right? But he gives no account in any of his articles or any of the debates, right, about how that works, okay, right? And as a matter of fact, there is no satisfactory account. There is an account you can give. You can try to bring in, so to speak, a definition of moral properties in terms of God. But Bill himself is well aware that that sort of version of a theologically based ethics is open to a Euthyphro style objection. So his goal is to evade that, right, and avoid it. But if you're going to avoid it, you have to give an account of how states involving an omnipotent and omniscient person can be a truth maker for basic moral statements. And Bill has never offered any account of how that's possible.
Well, I noticed that Dr. Tooley, rather than giving an account of his own explanation for objective moral values, tried to turn the tables and use it to criticize me. In fact, the view that I've defended, divine command morality, is defended by a number of eminent philosophers today, including people like Robert Adams in his book Finite and Infinite Goods, Philip Quinn, William Alston, Jean-Marie Idziak, and many others. As for Dr. Tooley's view, you see, he says, well, wrong-making property, that means it's a property which causes unnecessary suffering. But honestly, for the life of me, I can't see why on naturalism it's wrong to cause unnecessary suffering. Animals do this all the time. And on atheism, that's all we are, is just relatively advanced primates. Primates with somewhat more complex nervous systems. So I can't see any reason to think that that is a wrong-making property. Moreover, that theory is really completely inadequate as an ethical theory because it doesn't tell us what is good. It only would tell you what's wrong.
Time.
So I'm not persuaded he's answered the question.
A question for Dr. Craig.
We've heard arguments for the existence of God and against the existence of God. Wouldn't it be reasonable to conclude that we just don't know enough to say whether he exists or not?
Well, if you think that the arguments are evenly balanced, but I don't think they are. I certainly don't think in tonight's debate that it's evident that they're evenly balanced. I think it's been rather one-sided myself. So I think that my basic contention is true. Certainly there are arguments for atheism. I acknowledge that, and they have some force. But on balance, the arguments for theism are better. And so I think if you follow the evidence where it leads, you'll be a theist.
1 minute.
Right. Well, I mean, Bill has attempted to turn this debate into debate over naturalism versus supernaturalism, right? And so I don't know if you're thinking about that, right? But this is not a debate about supernaturalism versus naturalism. It's a debate about the existence of God, right? And I think that the argument from evil is an extremely natural argument. You go back to Job and so forth and so on, think about the problem of evil. I think it naturally strikes people that suffering and so on experienced by the innocent, including young children, right, is a prima facie objection to the existence of God. And the question is whether you can develop that into a solid argument, right? And the only way to attempt to do so is by bringing inductive logic to bear upon the question. I've done this in detail in Knowledge of God. I look at the main approaches to inductive logic, state description, structure description, and so on. Bill simply responds by, in effect, embracing inductive skepticism, right? The basic principle I use, the equiprobability principle, right, is an extremely plausible principle, not rejected in any system of inductive logic that I know of, right? And it leads to both a sound account of the argument from evil, and it provides an answer to inductive skepticism.
Time.
Reject that principle, and the situation is hopeless.
Question for Dr. Tooley.
Yes, Dr. Tooley. You stated that unnecessarily causing suffering on sentient beings is a wrong-making property. Is that a starting principle or a self-evident truth, or is there a wrong-making property that makes that a wrong-making property? Do you see what I mean?
Well, there are various ways one can go. Some people want to instead take things back to the satisfaction and frustration of desires, right? If you went that way, then you say that, that the reason it's wrong to cause suffering is that their desires, e.g. not to be experiencing that sensation, which are being frustrated, right? And so moral philosophers would disagree on that, okay? But I think relatively few philosophers would think that an act which has the property of causing suffering on sentient beings and so on is not an action that lacks a wrong-making property. Wrong-making property is something that makes something wrong, other things being equal. It can be outweighed by other considerations, so the claim is not that it's always wrong to cause suffering, right? But the claim is that if an action has that property, then that's the fact that makes the action prima facie wrong, and it will make it wrong in the absence of other considerations, right? And, if I think about my colleague Mike Humer, right, he defends ethical intuitionism, and his view is, again, that there's an a priori connection between things like property causing needless suffering on the one hand, and on the other hand, the property being morally wrong. And that seems to me to be a perfectly tenable theory, and Bill has no objections at all to that theory, right? No arguments that he's offered against it.
1 minute.
I just don't see any reason on atheism to think that causing unnecessary pain and suffering has a moral character to it. It seems to me that this is just natural. I would say that the property that makes things wrong, the wrong-making property, is being forbidden by God. God is the supreme good, what was called in the medieval times the summum bonum, the paradigm of goodness, and therefore has the authority to issue moral commands to us, which constitute our duties. So what makes something wrong is that it's forbidden by God, who is the moral authority. And that seems to me far more plausible than these moral duties on atheism. They're just sort of floating in the air without any sort of grounding.
Question for Dr. Craig.
Yes, Dr. Craig, I'm a Christian, so I'm not opposing your position on the existence of God, but rather a statement that you made this evening, which I've also heard made in previous debates, that an actual infinite is impossible, or infinity is merely an idea. And could you speak to the question, does not that reduce God to a mere idea or an impossible?
Good question. I think we need to distinguish between what one could call a quantitative infinite and a qualitative infinite. The infinity of God is not a quantitative infinite. It doesn't mean that God is made up of an infinite number of definite and discrete parts. When theologians talk about God's infinity, they mean it in a qualitative sense, that God is morally perfect, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and so forth. It's not a quantitative concept. In fact, I would say that there really is no attribute of God called infinity. The word infinity is just an umbrella term for expressing all of God's superlative properties: omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection, eternity, and metaphysical necessity. If you took all of those away, there isn't any property left over called infinity. There just is an umbrella term for all of those omni attributes. And none of those need involve a mathematical, quantitative concept of an infinite number of definite, discrete parts. So I don't think my argument against the mathematical infinity being instantiated in reality has any bearing on God's qualitative infinity.
1 minute response.
Well, I want to address the claim that some sort of quantitative notion of infinity is incoherent. I mean, the arguments that Bill offers for this are really just very bad arguments. So you get, infinity minus infinity. Well, if you have all the natural numbers, you take away, the even numbers, you're left with infinity, right? If, on the other hand, you have all the natural numbers and you take away all the numbers larger than 4, right, then you're left with 4. Contradiction. I mean, this is just a crazy argument, right? I mean, it's based upon the idea that somehow there's an incoherence, a contradiction in the notion of an actual infinity of things. But on the other hand, there's no contradiction in the existence of an infinity of natural numbers, right? And so mathematics is consistent, but somehow this just does not fit together at all, right? And he brings in talk about ideas and so on, but I mean, that doesn't help, right? If there's the contradiction in the existence of an actual number of things, right, there's going to be actually a contradiction in mathematics as well. And no mathematician would accept that sort of view.
Question for Dr. Tooley.
Dr. Tooley, you tried to prove that the existence of evil makes it highly unlikely for the existence of God. How do you account for all the good in the world?
Well, the existence of good is irrelevant to the argument, right? Okay. I mean, if on the other hand, the question was, is there a perfectly evil being in the world? Then you could run precisely the same argument, right? You could argue that there's good, in the world, that we don't see any such big bad-making properties associated with it, and so on. And so there'd be a good argument against the existence of a perfectly evil being. But I mean, the logic of the argument is such that basically you look at something that's morally wrong, right? Like the Haitian earthquake, right? And you say, look, if those are all the properties it has, the ones that we see, right, then surely a morally perfect being could not allow that. Now, Bill will disagree. Bill will say, God created all life and so on, and so he can wipe it out at any time. But that's just a morally crazy view. I doubt very much you think that, right? So suppose you don't agree with him about that. Suppose you think that, God can't just annihilate people right, left, and center anytime for any reason he pleases, right? He needs a justification for it, right? And so you look at the Haitian earthquake, right, and you see that it has this immense wrong-making property. Again, Bill denies this, I think, with great implausibility, right? He says, no, nothing wrong with that, okay, right? I think we believe that allowing suffering of that sort to happen to innocent individuals, allowing them to be killed and so on, those things are seriously wrong unless there are counterbalancing properties. Then the basic idea of my argument is you consider the possibilities. It could be there's some unknown right-making property that cancels that out and makes it morally permissible to allow it. But from a logical point of view, it's just as likely there's an unknown wrong-making property that puts things in the other direction. And when you perform the calculations, it turns out that the likelihood that the action is morally wrong, all things considered, is greater than 1/2. And so the goodness doesn't enter into the argument.
I've already argued tonight that the atheist does face a problem of good, namely to give any account of why there would be objective good and evil in an atheistic world. But let me say something in reply to the Haitian example. I've argued that God's primary purpose for human history is to bring the optimal number of people freely into relationship with himself. And we have no idea how the different evils and disasters in the world contribute to this. And I recently received an email from a fellow in Haiti, Seth Barnes, a missionary there. And this is what he wrote about this. He said, something is remarkable is happening over there. It's unprecedented in my experience as a missionary. Revival is too small a word for what we saw in Haiti. Often we weren't able to move our vehicles because of the parades of people praising Christ. Everywhere there were prayer meetings, groups as small as 20 or as large as 60,000. 3 months ago, the pastors of Haiti prayed for revival. They prayed that God would shake their land. They prayed that he would tear down the strongholds. The spiritual atmosphere of the country is completely different now. Voodoo priests, by the hundreds, have given their lives to Christ.
Time.
And I maintain that God can permit this sort of natural suffering in order to bring people freely into his kingdom and give them eternal life forever.
Question for Dr. Craig.
Dr. Craig.
I'm sorry. Wait a minute.
I've been following your work for some time now, probably 2 or 3 years. In your opening speech about the resurrection of Jesus, you listed 3 facts.
Yes.
Now, in former debates that I've listened, you list 4.
Yes.
And the 4th one being the burial of Joseph Arimathea.
Yes.
Now, why did you leave it out? And secondly, with the burial of Joseph Arimathea not being a fact, then how do we establish the empty tomb?
I left it out for time reasons. When I debate a Muslim theologian, I'll include a 5th fact, namely the crucifixion, because Muslims deny that Jesus was crucified, and yet this is an undeniable historical fact recognized by all historians. So there's the crucifixion, there's the burial by Joseph of Arimathea in the tomb, and then the 3 facts that I mentioned tonight. And in the interest of time, I mentioned the 3 and argued that the most plausible explanation is the resurrection. But as you know from my written work, I'm prepared to defend the historicity of all 5 of those facts and do so in my published work. I just want to emphasize, this is the majority view among New Testament historians today, that these facts are established. This isn't the view of just conservative or evangelical scholars. It's remarkable, but this does represent the mainstream conclusions of New Testament scholarship today. And I think that the best explanation of these facts is that the God of Israel raised Jesus from the dead, that Jesus was who he claimed to be, and God vindicated those claims in a dramatic and public way.
Yes, let me just comment on the resurrection of Jesus argument. The first thing one has to do is one has to look at the probability of there being miracles in the world. Now, this isn't to be done in a priori fashion, as many philosophers have been guilty. You need to look at it empirically, right? And you need to look at the modern world and see whether or not there are good reasons for thinking that miracles occur in the modern world, right? And there are a number of books on this by Lewis Rose, Faith Healing, and so on. A book by Randy investigating claims of faith healing. There was a report done by the Church of England back around 1920. There was also a report done by the British Medical Association and so on, right? Every careful study that's been done, including Miracles at Lourdes, is a book by D.J. West, 11 Lourdes Miracles, right, has turned up a blank, okay? There are no good candidates for miracles in the modern world, right? And so the question is, what's going on historically? Well, again, you have to look at things like The Growth of Healing Legends, this book by A.D. White, which details what happened in the case of St. Francis Xavier. Stories that had no miraculous element gradually get transformed into miracles, right? So that's the starting point for an examination of the probability that Jesus was resurrected, looking at whether or not miracles occur in the modern world.
Question for Dr. Tooley.
Dr. Tooley, your arguments only appear to challenge the morality of God. Would you attempt to disprove the existence of an all-knowing and all-powerful creator figure, and why?
Well, I think the situation is much less clear once you throw out the morality of God, right? Then the argument from evil is irrelevant. Now, Bill, of course, did not suggest that the argument from evil was irrelevant, right? It was only when I pointed out that his arguments were not arguments for a perfectly good God that he shifts to this minimal conception of God, right? And so the arguments would be very different, right? If this were a debate on naturalism versus supernaturalism, which it's not, right? But a number of theistic philosophers, including Bill, including Alvin Plantinga, cleverly attempt to turn the debate into a debate between naturalism and supernaturalism. This was Plantinga's strategy in the book that he wrote with me. His strategy was to attack naturalism. I pointed out that gets you to supernaturalism, but doesn't get you to God and monotheism. Now, Plantinga at least was honest, it seemed to me, right? He agreed that goodness had to be part of the definition of God. Bill wants to strip that out, okay, in order to avoid the force of the argument from evil and also to avoid the criticisms of the arguments that he offered. Suppose that you did raise the question of, is there an omnipotent, omniscient spiritual being? Then it's a very different ballgame, right? And you need arguments for naturalism, right? And they involve such things as the question of whether or not it's reasonable to believe that you and I have immaterial minds, okay? Or whether there are reasons to believe that the only things in the physical world that we know of are purely physical material things, right? That would be the focus of the argument. Now, I think there are good arguments of that sort, and it's a view that's widely accepted by contemporary philosophers. The people like David Armstrong and Jack Smart have defended it at length, okay? But it's a very different argument, and it's not the topic of this debate, much as Bill would like to make it the topic of this debate.
But would you support that position, or would you not?
Yeah. I think what is accurate is to say that the problem of evil cannot refute the cosmological argument or the teleological argument. These give you a creator and designer of the universe. And they don't pretend to give you the moral properties of this creator and designer. For that, you supplement it with the moral argument, which does give you God as the summum bonum, or the supreme good. So what this really means is that if the atheist is to deny that there is a creator and designer of the universe, he's got to do more than just put forth the problem of evil. He's got to refute the premises of the cosmological and teleological argument. Otherwise, he's stuck with a transcendent, timeless, spaceless, unfathomably powerful personal creator and designer of the world, which I think is a very significant conclusion to be drawn.
In the interest of time, because we want to have enough time for you to interact with the debaters for a few minutes before we all have to vacate the building and maybe buy some material, we want to take one more question for each of the debaters. So we have one more for Dr. Craig.
Sir, this is coming from a struggling Christian point of view versus a skeptical one. But if cause and effect for the most part, God is all-powerful, almighty, and all-knowing, correct?
Yes.
That was my idea of it, and that's the way I'm familiar with God.
Yes.
But my question is, for the most part, if God is all-powerful, all-knowing and everything, for the most part, when he created Adam and Eve, he was kind of shocked that Eve did that. But if he created them, did he know they were going to do that? In respect, does that mean, for the most part, if I'm just doomed to go to hell, doesn't mean I'm just going to go to hell, since he already knows technically when it's going to happen?
I think God certainly does know what will happen. Yes, he has foreknowledge of the future. But you're expressing a position called theological fatalism, which says that if you know what will happen, then that thing cannot fail to not happen, or to happen. And I think that is a fallacious argument. I've written a great deal on this. You could look on my website, reasonablefaith.org, or one of my books like The Only Wise God. It moves from saying necessarily if God foreknows X will happen, X will happen, and the premise God knows X will happen, to saying, therefore, necessarily X will happen. And that commits a fallacy of modal logic. All that follows from God's knowing that X will happen is that X will happen. But it doesn't follow that it will happen necessarily. It could fail to happen. But if it were to fail to happen, then God would have known something different. So God's knowledge is chronologically prior to the event, but the event is logically prior to God's foreknowledge. The event doesn't occur because God foreknows it. God foreknows it because it will occur. Do you see? God's knowledge is like an infallible barometer. An infallible barometer doesn't determine the weather. It's that the weather determines the barometer. And from the reading of the barometer, you know exactly what the weather will be. It's infallible. But that doesn't mean the weather has to be that way. You see? The barometer merely foreshadows what will happen. And if what would happen would be different, then the barometer would read differently. So there's no kind of fatalism that results from divine foreknowledge. You still have the freedom to do A or not A. And whatever you do will determine what God foreknew.
2 points. One is that the idea of divine foreknowledge is deeply problematic. What it presupposes is that later events can cause earlier events. Now, the philosophical jury is not in on whether or not that's logically possible. But there are a number of people who have attempted to show that backwards causation running from later events to earlier events is logically impossible and gives rise to a contradiction. And you can show that attempts by people like David Lewis and so on to get around that are unsatisfactory, right? So divine foreknowledge is very problematic. But secondly, to comment on the notion of hell, at various points, Bill has said, defended hell, okay? But I mean, think about a being who's perfectly good, right? Now, the question is, why would you think that being would set up the world in such a way that if you don't believe certain things or if you do certain things, you'll wind up in a place that's a very unpleasant place that you'll never be able to get out of? It seems to me that a truly good God would leave the door open for prodigal sons and daughters to return at any point. If the door is locked on hell, that's something God has done, right? If there's no escape from it, right? And that seems to me to be a radically unsatisfactory conception of a being that one wants them to go on to describe as perfectly good. So I think that idea should be rejected.
Yes, you seem to use inductive reasoning a great deal in your argument. And the definition that I have heard is using specific examples to draw general conclusions, correct? So I was wondering if, by the definition itself, if inductive reasoning is capable of yielding absolute certainty of anything.
Okay, well, first of all, let me say that the conception of inductive reasoning that you've been exposed to is an unsatisfactory conception. It's a conception you find in the philosopher David Hume, where you look at various instances. Here's a raven, it's black. Here's another raven, it's black. Probably the next raven is black, or probably all ravens are black, okay? You can show that if that's all there is to inductive reasoning, then there are very skeptical challenges that you can't answer in any way. For example, one thing is that you can't get from knowledge of the macroscopic world, tables and chairs, to knowledge of electrons, protons, and neutrons. You'll never get an instance we'll get started, okay? So philosophers realized, beginning with C.S. Peirce in the 1890s, that you needed a broader conception. And it's sometimes referred to as inference, the best explanation, right? So the idea is that you look at a hypothesis, you see what its predictions are, you check out whether or not they're true, you look at what it can explain causally and so on. And the greater its explanatory power, the more reason there is to think that hypothesis is true, right? You need to consider competing hypotheses and then see whether they have equal explanatory power and whether they're as simple and so forth and so on. So you need a much broader conception of induction than you have, right? Now, induction does not lead to certainty, right? But the idea is, if you've looked at 1,000 things with a certain property and you found they have another property, right, then the idea is the probability that the next one has that property is greater than it would have been before you examined the 1,000 things, right? So the idea is that induction can gradually raise the probability of something, right? And as I say, the sort of principle I appeal to of equiprobability can show how that's done, okay? And that's not a trivial task because on many conceptions, there's no way of showing that induction is a sound method. So its soundness consists in raising the probability of hypotheses, right? It doesn't consist in showing you that something's absolutely certain. It can't do that.
Yeah. I want to reiterate that Dr. Tooley's inductive argument from evil is based upon principles of inductive reasoning that he derives from Rudolf Carnap in the mid-20th century, which, according to the probability theorists I've talked to, are highly controverted and yield arbitrary and therefore non-objective probabilities. They're designed for a highly artificial language. They don't apply to real-life situations, and that therefore virtually no philosopher regards these as yielding the correct estimation of objective probabilities. Instead, we need an alternative approach to justify inductive reasoning, such as I offered tonight from Peter Walley's article in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society entitled Inferences from Multinomial Data, Learning About a Bag of Marbles, where this professor of mathematics justifies a robust Bayesian approach that doesn't depend upon these controverted principles that Dr. Tooley relies on, and that are at the very heart of his inductive argument for evil. If those principles go, the whole argument goes down the drain. And for that reason alone, I think that his argument against God tonight is a failure.
There's enough time left in the evening, perhaps, if you can hang around for some interaction with the debaters, if they are so willing, and maybe get an autograph of their books. Be aware that there are books for sale in the back. You might want to avail yourself to those and purchase. If you have your information card filled out, if you would be so kind to drop that in the box, and if you are so inclined as well to contribute financially to the efforts of Ratio Christi, you can make your donation there in that same box. Thank you for your attendance tonight.